The Alpha King had ordered a wife. Not asked, not courted, ordered. The way a lord commands grain from a conquered field. And the Ashenmere household had obeyed, dressing their daughter in ivory linen, pressing silver pins into her hair, and pointing her toward a chapel, where a stranger's seal waited on a contract she had never been allowed to read. What no one knew was what Edith had overheard 3 nights before the wedding. Her stepmother's voice, low and precise in the candlelit study. Once she is delivered, the debt is cleared. The estates, the silver, the land, all of it passes to your son. She will have nothing to come back to. She was not being given away. She was being erased. So on the morning of her wedding, with 9 silver coins sewn into her cloak lining and borrowed boots on her feet, she climbed the orchard wall and walked north, straight toward the man who had ordered her. What do you think happened when she finally stood face to face with the Alpha King and told him everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The wedding veil smelled of dried roses and something older, beeswax, cold stone, the particular silence of a house that had learned to hold its breath. Edith noticed it the moment her stepmother's hands pressed the silver pins into her hair. 3 needles, each placed with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this morning for longer than a fortnight. "You look like your mother," Lady Maren said. She said it softly. She always said the cruelest things softly. Edith kept her eyes on the bronze mirror, watching the stranger it showed her. Ivory gown edged with embroidered cornflowers, copper hair coiled at the nape, a face still enough to belong to a carved saint above a chapel door. Her mother had died when she was 8. She had one portrait. She did not look like her mother. But Maren had learned, over the 11 years she had presided over Ashenmere Hall, exactly which words unlocked something helpless in Edith's chest. She breathed through it. Slow. Deliberate. Outside the narrow window, the gray courtyard held all the stillness of a morning waiting to become something irreversible. The escort carriage from Veldrath Keep had arrived at first light. Not the Lord of Veldrath himself, only his seneschal, bearing contracts and sealing wax. She had watched the black-curtained carriage roll through the gate, and the knowledge had settled into her ribcage like iron cooling into a mold. 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived, bearing the seal of the North March, a rearing wolf, a crown of iron, pressed in black wax. Her stepmother had broken it open in the great hall before Edith had descended the stairs. She remembered walking in to find Maren and her stepbrother Aldrich bent over the parchment, and the look they shared when they heard her footsteps. Not excitement, something older, something closer to the face of a man who has waited a long time for a door to open. "Why me?" she had asked at supper that evening. "Why not a girl who wants this?" "Because you are the last true daughter of the Ashenmere line," Maren had said. The Lord of Veldrath's counsel was specific. Edith had looked at Aldrich across the table. He had looked away. The days that followed moved with an efficiency that unsettled her. A seamstress summoned from the city, a bridal chest packed with linens she had not chosen. The estate's old steward quietly replaced by a man whose name Edith did not know. When she asked to see the contract, Maren said it was with the notary. When she asked to write to the Lord before the ceremony, Maren said it was not the northern custom. When she asked why the wedding had been fixed with such urgency, she was told the council required it. The council. Always the council. On the 4th night, she had gone downstairs for water. She passed the door to the solar, slightly open, a thread of candlelight across the stone, and heard her stepmother's voice first. Low. Measured. Once the girl is delivered and the bond rights sealed, the debt is discharged entirely. A man's voice she did not recognize. The Ashenmere estates, the fields, the mill, the silver holdings in the Eastern Wood, pass legally to your son upon execution of the Northern Covenant. That was always the structure. Then Aldrich, quieter. She won't have standing to contest it. Once she's at Veldrath, she's bound by Northern law. She'll have nothing to come back to. Nothing, Maren agreed. There was a satisfaction in it that had no warmth at all. Edith stood in the dark corridor for a very long time. She was aware, with the strange clarity that arrives in the moments before the world changes, of the smell of tallow smoke and cold ash, and the sound the old house made when the wind came from the north. These things had been home to her for 11 years. In that moment, they became something else. The walls of a structure built around her without her knowledge, designed with a single purpose. She was not being sent to be a wife. She was being sent to be erased. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. She thought with great care, and by the time gray light touched the windows, she understood the full shape of what had been constructed. And she began, very quietly, to dismantle it. The morning of the wedding arrived, like any other morning, indifferent to what it contained. Edith wore the gown for 2 hours, long enough to stand in the chapel anteroom while the seneschal organized his papers, long enough to watch 2 household guards take up position at the double doors, long enough to understand, with absolute certainty, that no one in this building would stop what was about to happen. So she stopped it herself. The coin purse had been sewn into the lining of her old traveling cloak 3 nights ago. 9 silver pennies, 2 gold marks, everything accumulated from 6 months of quarterly allowance, set aside with the unnamed instinct of a woman who senses a tide before it turns. The cloak hung on a peg in the anteroom, the kind of detail no one had thought to remove because no one had imagined it necessary. She put it on over the gown. The hem brushed the floor. She walked to the anteroom side door. The one whose latch she had known since childhood was loose on wet mornings. It was a wet morning. The latch gave. The garden was empty. She crossed to the orchard wall, found the place where the old apple tree leaned close enough to the stone, and climbed. She dropped into the lane on the far side and walked away from Ashenmere Hall without looking back. This was the one thing she was entirely certain of. She did not look back. The village of Dunmere was a mile down the lane. She had been walking 3/4 of an hour when the pain in her heel announced itself. The bridal slippers were thin-soled, made for chapel floors, not lanes. By the time the alehouse sign came into view, a carved boar, badly weathered, her walking had reduced itself to something that could not honestly be called a stride. She pushed through the door anyway, because stopping was not an option she was prepared to entertain. The room smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Behind the long oak counter stood a woman of perhaps 50, gray-streaked hair pulled back, eyes that moved over Edith with the unhurried comprehensiveness of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading the truth beneath what people presented. She looked at the wedding gown hem beneath the cloak, the mud on the slippers, Edith's face. "Sit down," she said finally, "before you fall down." Her name was Agnes. She brought broth without being asked, then bread, then, from some back storeroom, a pair of stout leather boots a size too large, set on the table with the directness of someone who understood that practical problems required practical solutions. "You're the Ashenmere girl," Agnes said, not a question. "Seneschal rode back to Veldrath empty-handed this morning. They'll be looking south first, toward the city." She refilled the broth. "That buys you time. Don't waste it." "How far to the Veldrath borderlands?" 2 days on foot, less if you find a cart willing. The north road goes through Ashenwood. Don't stop there. Don't speak to anyone who comes at you from the tree line. Keep moving until you're through." Edith understood. Unbound wolves, shifters without pack allegiance, without the discipline that territory imposed. "I'll be traveling to Veldrath," Edith said. "Not as what they arranged for me to be." She had not said it aloud before. The words tasted like the first breath after a long submersion. "I need to speak to the Lord himself." Agnes studied her. Then she disappeared into the back room and returned with a wool dress. Brown, plain, the kind of garment that drew no attention and asked nothing of the wearer. "Leave the gown," she said. "On that road, it'll do worse than slow you down." Edith dressed in the back room, folded the ivory gown with its embroidered cornflowers over the stool, and looked at herself in the small steel mirror. A woman in plain brown, copper hair in a plain braid, boots stuffed with rags at the toe. She looked, she thought, like someone nobody would remember. Good. The North Road in early morning was the color of old pewter. Birch trees stood stripped to white bone on either side, their branches empty against a sky that had not yet decided what kind of day to be. Edith walked fast and thought faster. The facts arranged themselves as she moved. Maren had built a transaction around her. The Ashenmere estates, the silver holdings, the mill rights promised against a debt Edith had never been told about, with Edith herself as the instrument of transfer. The moment she set her seal to the Northern Covenant, the property passed to Aldrich. Northern law recognized a high-born bride's estate as absorbed upon the bond right, unless otherwise protected in writing. Maren had known this. Edith suspected she had known it before she had ever agreed to marry Lord Edmund Ashenmere. The question that mattered now was Leif of Veldrath, the Alpha Lord of the North March, the man who ruled 6 allied packs from a fortress called Greyspire. What did he know? Had he negotiated knowingly, accepted a woman delivered like cargo to settle another family's debts? Or had his council arranged it in his name, the way powerful men with large territories sometimes allowed things to be arranged, with insufficient scrutiny of the detail? It mattered enormously. The difference was the entire structure of her argument. She was not going to disappear into Greyspire as the compliant Southern bride they had packaged her as. She was going to arrive on her own terms, by her own road, speak directly to the Lord himself, and lay out clearly what had been done in his name and what she required in return. She had one thing to offer: the truth. She intended to make it enough. The ashenwood announced itself before she saw it, a change in the air, resin and something beneath it she could not name, a cold that was different from the ambient cold of the road. The trees ahead were older, darker, their canopy closing over the path like a hand folding shut. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her pace. She was halfway through when they came, 2 men from the tree line to her left, moving with the unhurried ease of people who had been waiting. One was perhaps 40, with a scar dividing his left brow. The other was younger, watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Long walk for a woman alone," the older one said. "It is," Edith agreed, and kept walking. He matched her pace. The younger one moved to her right. The geometry of it was not accidental. "There's a toll," the scarred man said, "for unaffiliated travelers." Her heart was loud in her chest, but her feet kept their rhythm, because stopping was precisely what they wanted. She made the decision in the space of a single breath. "I'm affiliated," she said. The same voice she used when Maren was attempting to manage her. The voice that offered information rather than emotion. "I travel under the covenant of Greyspire, Lord Leif's household." She did not slow. "If you have a dispute about the toll arrangement, I recommend you take it to the border wardens. They'll be at the way station by nightfall." A silence. The trees dripped. Above the canopy, a crow called once and was answered by nothing. The scarred man looked at the younger one. Something passed between them. "Pass on, then," he said. She passed on. Her hands were shaking by the time the trees opened again into pale sky and a wider road. She pressed them flat against her thighs beneath the cloak and kept walking, because shaking was allowed, as long as her feet did not stop. The cart found her in the mid-afternoon, a wool merchant heading north who offered her a ride on the fleeces without being asked. She climbed up before he finished the sentence. She sat in the back with gray wool piled around her and the sky going amber above the tree line, and for the first time since she had climbed the orchard wall, she let herself feel the weight of the last 12 hours. The chapel anteroom, the loose latch, Agnes's face, the ashenwood and the shaking hands. She had left everything she had ever called home with 9 silver pennies and borrowed boots, and no plan beyond the conviction that she was a problem only she could solve. She was still here, still thinking. That counted for something. Greyspire appeared as the cart crested the last ridge. First a dark suggestion against the skyline, towers rising from rock itself. Then the light shifted, and she could see the true scale of it. The outer walls were the height of 10 men. The banners snapping in the ridge wind bore the rearing wolf in silver on dark gray, and there was no attempt at welcome in them, no softening of the message. This was a fortress. It had been a fortress for a very long time, and had never needed to pretend otherwise. Edith sat up straighter in the wool and looked at it steadily. She had arrived on her own feet, in borrowed boots, having talked her way through the ashenwood, with nothing but the steadiness of her voice. She had arrived without being delivered. She intended to use that. The way station at the base of Greyspire's outer road had 3 guards in dark leather standing at the gate with the bearing of men whose default answer was no. Edith climbed down from the cart before it stopped, straightened her cloak, and walked toward them with her chin level. The tallest stepped forward, pale eyes, close-cropped hair, the flat gaze of someone trained to assess threat and rank simultaneously. "State your purpose." "I'm here under Lord Leif's summons. My name is Edith of Ashenmere. I was expected at the hall 2 days ago. I traveled separately from the seneschal's party. You were to arrive by formal escort." The escort returned without me. She gave him no gap to fill. "I would like to speak with whoever manages arrivals for Lord Leif's household." They made her wait outside. The ridge wind was persistent and cold, carrying the smell of distant snow, and something metallic she was beginning to associate with wolf territory. Something charged in the air itself, in a way she had no name for. She stood still and did not let her teeth chatter. This required genuine effort. The man who emerged was not a guard. Silver at the temples, dark wool coat bearing the Greyspire crest, the bearing of someone who managed consequential things with practiced calm. "Mistress Ashenmere, I am Counselor Rowan. I oversee the Lord's household affairs." She could see him placing her in his mental ledger, and finding the entry did not match. "I am aware my arrival is irregular," she said, before he could say it himself. "I traveled on foot, alone, through Ashenwood. I require a direct audience with Lord Leif. What I have to say concerns the terms of the arrangement made in his name, and it is not something I am willing to convey through intermediaries." Rowan blinked. Just once. "That is somewhat unprecedented," he said carefully. "I have walked 2 days to be here. I am not going to stop 1 door short." They gave her a waiting room. Small, stone, a narrow cot, a basin of clean water, a candle already lit, a cup of warm cider on the table that had not been there when she walked in. Someone had thought about the room before she arrived. She washed the road from her face and hands, sat on the edge of the cot, and waited. She did not lie down. Lying down felt too close to surrender. An hour passed. Through the walls she could hear the way station's pulse, boots on stone, low voices, the shift change of guards, horses in the stable. This place had a density to it, a gravity. Somewhere that consequential things happened with regularity, and no one made more of them than necessary. She was composing, in her mind, what she intended to say. Not pleading. She had learned early that pleading was currency spent on people who had already decided. She was going to present facts, consequences, and a proposal that served both parties. She was going to be... The door opened without a knock. Edith stood. The man who stepped through was not Counselor Rowan. He was tall. She registered that first, then understood immediately that tall was not the right word. He filled the door frame the way certain things fill a space, not by size alone, but by the weight of presence that some men carry, and most do not. Dark hair pushed back from a face of clean angles and controlled stillness. Dark leather traveling clothes. A heavy cloak the color of storm cloud. Across his left jaw, a fresh cut, shallow and recent, the edges still darkened. His eyes, when they found her, were dark gray. Not the gray of overcast sky, but of iron ore, of flint, of things that hold their edge. They landed on her with a quality she had not expected. Not assessment, not appraisal. Something more like absolute notice. The way a hawk stills in the air when it has found what it was looking for. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at her. She looked back. "You're Leif," she said. It was not a question. "I am." His voice was low and unhurried, carrying the authority of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "You asked to speak with me directly. It seemed poor manners to send anyone else." She had prepared for intermediaries, for layers of protocol. She had not prepared for him standing 6 feet away, in a room barely large enough for both of them, looking at her, as though she were the most interesting problem he had encountered in some time. She did not let the gap in her preparation show. "Then I'll say what I came to say." She said it clearly, without drama, the way she had rehearsed it in the cart. The arrangement her stepmother had made was fraudulent. The contract his counsel had drawn up contained a clause that would transfer the Ashenmere estates to her stepbrother, Aldrich, the moment she set her seal to it. She had not been told. She had not been consulted. She had been dressed and pointed at a chapel. "I am not here to refuse the arrangement outright." This was the sentence she had most carefully weighed. "I am here to renegotiate it on honest terms. I will come to Greyspire. I will cooperate with whatever your counsel requires, but I want the Ashenmere estate legally secured in my name, the fraudulent clause struck from the contract, and the debt my stepmother used as justification examined, because I believe it was fabricated." Something in Leif's expression sharpened, the way a room sharpens when a window is opened. "You have documentation," he said. "I have nothing." She kept her voice level. "I left with coins sewn into a cloak lining and boots that don't fit. But I heard the conversation. I know who was in the room. And if you send someone to examine the Ashenmere estate records at the Southern Registry, you will find that the covenant clause in your contract contradicts the terms of my father's will. He entailed the estate to the true bloodline, explicitly, in language that does not permit the reading your counsel received. That requires verification. I cannot revise a counsel-negotiated covenant on the basis of an unwitnessed claim. I understand that. I am asking you to look." She held his gaze and found it harder than she had expected, not because it was hostile, but because there was so much in it, and the room was too small for it to go anywhere else. "I am asking you to treat this as a question worth investigating, rather than an inconvenience to be managed." A long moment. "The debt," he said. "You believe it was invented. My father was a careful man. He kept meticulous accounts. I have never seen a record of any financial obligation to an outside party. I believe my stepmother created it to give your counsel a reason to accept the contract, and to give herself a reason to need it." Something moved through Leif's expression, quick, cold, the thing that lives beneath anger in people who keep a very tight rein. "Fabricated," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became conscious of the borrowed boots, the unwashed braid, the fact that she had walked into this room with nothing but the architecture of her own argument. "You'll stay the night," he said. "Tomorrow you'll be taken to Greyspire. I'll send a rider to the Southern Registry at first light." Not a concession. Not quite a promise, but not a dismissal. Edith let the breath she had been holding release, slowly, making sure it did not show. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her once more, that steady iron-gray regard, and then left, pulling the door closed behind him with a quietness that was, somehow, heavier than a slam. She sat down on the edge of the cot. Her hands, she noticed with some surprise, were perfectly still. Greyspire in the morning was a different creature than it had been at dusk. In the amber light of arrival, it had been severe, geological, a thing of ridge and shadow. In the clear cold of morning, escorted through its outer gates in a small carriage with Counselor Rowan, it was something else entirely. A living fortress, centuries old, with the unhurried confidence of a place that had never needed to announce what it was. Her rooms were in the north wing, stone walls warmed by tapestries in deep red and gray. A writing table under a window that looked down on a training yard, where men worked through sword forms in the frost, their breath clouding in the cold air. A fire had been laid and lit, and on the table beside the basin, someone had left a small crock of honey beside a cup of something still steaming. Someone had thought about this room before she arrived. She stood at the window and watched the men train, and did not know what to do with that. A maidservant named Willa appeared within the hour, quiet and competent, bringing a breakfast tray without being asked, with the efficiency of someone who understood that a person who had walked 2 days required feeding before anything else. Willa left a change of clothes and pointed Edith toward the library, if she wished for somewhere to be. The library was in the East Tower. 3 walls of shelves, floor to ceiling, rolling ladders on iron tracks, a long central table with 6 chairs and 4 candlestands, a small hearth burning low and clean. The collection was serious, not decorative, but used. Spines worn, volumes marked, several left open on the shelves rather than shelved spine out. She found a seat at the central table and began to think. The rider had gone south at dawn. The registry was 3 days' ride. The response would take a week at minimum. In the meantime, she was here, without a covenant sealed, without a formal status, without any clean precedent she could identify. Not a prisoner, not a guest. A question, one that Leif of Veldrath had agreed to investigate rather than close. It was more than she had expected to win in a single night. On the first day, she read. The library held 3 volumes on Northern land law and a slender, heavily annotated text on bond right contracts, the legal framework governing formal claiming in the North March Pacts, the obligations it created, the protections it extended. She read the protections section twice. A bonded mate under Northern Covenant was not property. She was a protected party. Her assets, if documented prior to the right, could be legally secured against transfer. The covenant clause Marin had buried in the contract was only enforceable if the party had signed with full knowledge and without documented coercion. If coercion could be proven, and Edith believed it could, the clause was void. She was building a second argument, a contingency. On the second afternoon, she was deep in notes when she became aware, without hearing anything, that she was no longer alone. She looked up. Leif stood at the far end of the central table, with a document in his right hand, reading it. No riding gear today. Dark tunic, plain belt, leather bracers on his forearms. Without the full formal weight of the waystation night, he was no less present, but differently so. More visible. Closer to something. He looked up from the document and found her already looking. You've been here both days, he said. The collection is excellent, she said. His gaze moved to the bond right volume and the parchment of notes in her small, neat hand. He set his own document down and moved to the opposite side of the table, the full width of dark oak between them, and looked at what she had written without touching it. Northern inheritance law, he said. A second argument, she said, in case the registry records come back compromised. My stepmother has had years to build this structure. I prefer 2 lines of approach to 1. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She had not expected that. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at her in the low firelight. Tell me about your father. She had prepared for legal challenges. Not this. Why? She asked. Because the arrangement came through his estate, Leif said. And because you said he was a careful man. I want to understand who he was. The library fire shifted, sending a new angle of warmth across the table. He was a scholar mostly, she said. He ran the estate competently, but it wasn't where his attention lived. He liked old maps. He liked the records of things that had already happened. He was quiet, not cold, just interior. He kept what mattered to him close and didn't say it aloud unless he had reason to. She stopped because she was saying more than she had intended. The reason was sitting across from her, with an expression of genuine attention that was very difficult to speak into without continuing. "He sounds," Leif said carefully, "like a man who would have left an unambiguous will." "He did, which is why I know the document your counsel received was not faithful to it. Your stepmother was his second wife. He married her when I was 12. He trusted her." She kept her voice level. He was not always a reliable judge of that quality in people. Something moved through Leif's expression, brief and contained. "Neither was I," he said, "in this matter." It was a significant thing to say, not a confession of weakness, but accountability offered without deflection. Something in her assessment of him shifted, slightly but meaningfully. "Your counsel negotiated in good faith," she said, "on the information they were given. My counsel should have verified more thoroughly." Flat. Plain. The statement of a standard not met, with no performance of regret attached. "That is also on me." The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. The fire crackled. Outside, the courtyard had emptied, frost deepening into late afternoon. "What did you actually want from the arrangement?" she asked. "Not the estates. What was the actual purpose?" "Stability," he said. "The North March pacts have been without a bonded lady for 7 years. There are factions that use that absence as leverage against the alliances I need to hold. A bond right with a high-born Southern house was meant to close that argument. I was not looking for something elaborate. I was looking for someone with the capacity and the will." "Capacity and will," she repeated, neither of which was confirmed before the arrangement was made. "No." In retrospect, that was a significant omission. She looked at him in the library's quiet. The fire, the smell of old vellum and cold stone. It was possible to see him as something other than the abstract force she had been steeling herself against since Dunmere. He was careful, not performing carefulness, but in the manner of a man who had learned at some cost that carelessness was expensive. She was not ready to call it trust. But she filed what she was observing alongside everything else she was noting. "I'd like to know when your rider returns," she said. "You'll be the first I tell." He stood, retrieved his document, and paused at the door. "The argument you've been building, the bond right inheritance precedent. It's sound. It's also more work than most people in your position would have done." He left. The door closed quietly. Edith sat alone with the fire and the half-written argument, and permitted herself, for one precise moment, to be honest about what she was feeling. She had come to Greyspire expecting an opponent. She had found something considerably more difficult to navigate. Not an enemy, not yet an ally. Something uncomfortably close to a person she might, under other circumstances, have wanted to know. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The third night she was woken by the sound of fighting. Not inside the fortress, outside, in the outer ward. The clash of iron on iron, short and sharp, then voices directing urgent action, then the gate. Edith sat up in the dark. The fire had burned to coals. She crossed to the window. In the outer ward below, 3 torches were moving. A small group of men pressed toward the keep's inner gate. One of the mounted figures wore the storm-gray cloak, and she recognized the set of his shoulders before she recognized anything else. Her stomach dropped before she understood why. He was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an injury. His right hand was pressed to his left side, and in the torchlight she could see the darker stain spreading below it. She dressed quickly and did not stop to ask herself why. Willa appeared in the corridor at a near run. An ambush on the east road, she said. 3 men from a rival pack who had been waiting in the dark. Lord Leif had taken a blade to the ribs. Not mortal, not minor. "Where is he?" "The private solar, my lady, but take me there." The solar was larger than she had expected. Walls hung with maps, a writing table buried in documents, a long chair by the fire where Leif now sat with his shirt open. A physician worked at the wound, with clean cloth and a clay pot that smelled of rendered fat and dried herbs. Rowan was present, 2 guards, the physician's apprentice. Leif looked up when the door opened and found her standing in the frame. His expression did not change, but something in it settled, the way a door settles when it finds its frame. "You should be in your rooms," he said. "You're bleeding," she said. "Less than I was." "I'm told you walked through Ashenwood alone." "I did." "Then perhaps we both have a habit of going toward difficult things, rather than away from them." The physician glanced between them and said nothing. Edith crossed to the near side of the chair, far enough to stay out of the physician's way. The wound was a cut along the left ribs, long but not deep, already closed on one end. A blade meant to do considerably more damage than it had managed. She could see the tension in Leif's jaw as the physician worked, the controlled stillness of a man who did not permit pain to perform on his behalf. She found the nearest chair and sat without asking permission. "Was it connected to the contract?" she said quietly. "To my being here?" A pause 1 beat too long. "Possibly. There are parties who would prefer the Council alliance to fail." His jaw tightened once as the physician pressed a compress to the wound. "I have managed it. You are sitting in a chair with a blade wound in your side. A shallow one." His eyes moved to her, and something in them was quieter than usual, unguarded in the specific way that pain sometimes makes a person. "I've had worse." She believed him. She found this not remotely comforting. The physician finished in silence, bandaged what needed bandaging, and departed with his apprentice. Rowan, after a look at Leif, followed them. Which left her alone in the solar with the Lord of Greyspire and the fire and the particular honesty of very late nights, which stripped the formality out of things, whether you invited it or not. She should leave. He needed rest. She knew this clearly. She did not leave immediately. "I heard the ambush from my window," she said. "I saw you in the courtyard." "And you came down," he said. She looked at her hands. "Yes." "You were concerned." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes?" The fire settled. Something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. Not unpleasant. Something that had not been present yesterday. "Rest," she said, and stood. "You've lost blood. Don't let anyone bring you documents until morning." The corner of his mouth moved. The near thing, the adjacent thing, what his face did instead of smiling. "Is that an order?" "It is excellent advice," she said, "offered by someone with no authority to give orders, to which you may respond as you see fit." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it needed to. "Good night, Edith of Ashenmere," he said. She paused at the door. The sound of her name in his voice had a quality she could not account for. Unhurried, deliberate, as though the syllables were worth getting right. "Good night," she said, and went. She lay awake for a long time after, watching the ceiling. Her heart was doing something unreliable. She noted this, the way she had noted the shaking hands in the Ashenwood, as information, filed carefully, not yet acted on, but not forgotten. She found him in the library the next morning. He should not have been there. The physician had been explicit about rest. But there he was, at the far end of the central table, with a sheaf of documents, reading with the focused attention of a man for whom stopping was its own kind of difficulty. He moved carefully, accounting for his side, but he was standing. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "The physician will make your life complicated if he finds you here," she said. "He can try." He set down the documents. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected." She crossed to her usual chair and sat. She noticed, without commenting on it, that he had chosen the chair directly across from hers, rather than at the far end. "You?" "Well enough." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Tell me something." "What?" "Anything. Something true. I spend a great deal of time in rooms where people tell me what they have calculated I want to hear." I find I am not tired of things that are simply true. The morning light from the courtyard window was pale and clear, catching the edge of his jaw, the clean angles of it, the shadow of a day unshaved, the cut healing in a clean line. I haven't stopped thinking about the contract since I arrived, she said. I build legal arguments in my head during meals. I am aware this is not how a woman manages a difficult situation with equanimity. No, he said. It is how a woman manages one extremely well. She looked at him. That was honest, she said. You asked for honest. Something moved across his face, related to the near smile, but not quite it. You are also, if I may say so, the most unexpected development in my counsel's affairs in some years. I am not certain that is a compliment. I am not certain either, he said. But it is true. She looked down at her notes, because looking at him was becoming something she needed to be careful about. This was the thing about slow fires. They were warm long before you registered the heat. The rider should return by tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow or the day after. He said it with the matter-of-fact quality she was learning to recognize as his version of reassurance. And if the records have been altered, the bond right precedent you've been building will hold. Coercion voids the clause. We have your testimony and the full timeline. It will be enough. She looked up. You've read my notes. You left them on the table. The near smile, brief and warm. I was curious. She should have been annoyed. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not. You could have asked, she said. I could have, he agreed. I didn't, because I wanted to know what you were actually thinking, rather than what you chose to present. There is usually a difference. With you, there wasn't. Below the window, someone was crossing the training yard. She was aware, with great precision, of the 3 feet of dark oak between them, and the way that distance was beginning to feel like less. My father, she said, would have liked this library. She had not meant to say it. It arrived the way things do, when the defenses come down without your noticing. Leif was quiet for a moment. Tell me about him. Not the legal version. The real one. She looked at the fire. He was gentle, she said. Not weak. There is a difference, and he understood it. He was quietly brave in the way of people who have decided what matters, and do not need applause for it. He read to me on winter evenings until I was old enough to prefer to read myself, and then he sat in the same chair anyway and read alongside me. She paused. He trusted people too easily. He saw the best of what was there and didn't look for what was absent. He was lonely after my mother died. That was the opening Marin found. He sounds, Leif said quietly, like a man worth protecting. He died 4 years ago. I am a little late for that. No. His voice was unhurried, certain. You're protecting what he built, what he intended. That is not late. That is exactly the right time. She looked at him across the table in the pale winter morning and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. She picked up her pen. He picked up his document. They worked in silence for an hour, and it was the most comfortable silence she could remember. The rider arrived 2 days later. Edith was in the library when Willa came for her, moving with the contained urgency of someone who knows the difference between haste and alarm. Counselor Rowan asks for you. The registry rider has returned. The great hall was lit by late morning light. Rowan stood at the council table with 3 older council members. Leif was at the far end, standing, which she was beginning to understand was where he chose to be when he was containing something. The rider's satchel lay open on the table. The registry has returned Lord Edmund Ashenmere's estate records, Rowan said. He unrolled a document and set it before her. She read it. The original will, filed 11 years ago, entailed the Ashenmere estates and all silver holdings to his eldest natural-born child. Clear, unambiguous, exactly what she had known it to be. The document submitted to Greyspire's council had been altered in 4 places. The entailment clause removed and replaced with a life interest clause, permitting disposal of assets upon bond right. A fabricated debt instrument added, supposedly signed by Lord Edmund in his final year. A false codicil, granting Maren guardianship of estate decisions. And the date on the will altered by 5 years, to make the fabricated debt appear to legally supersede the original terms. 4 changes. Systematic, careful, the work of someone who understood exactly how these documents were read. Edith set the document down. The creditor, Leif said. His voice had the quality of still water over very deep ground. Can they be located? The name appears in no merchant guild record. No tax roll, no land registration, no credit ledger we could access, Rowan said. The solicitor beside him nodded. The entity does not exist. It was invented, Edith said. The quality of the room's silence changed. My counsel was provided with forged documents, Leif said. Still, that still water voice. His eyes were on the parchment, and there was something in his stillness that she recognized as the thing beneath anger in a man who keeps a very tight rein. Yes, she said. And you walked 2 days through Ashenwood to tell me so. There was no one else who could. He looked at her then. The gray of his eyes, in the hall's clear light, held something she had not seen there before. Not the assessment of the waystation night, not the careful attention of the library. Something quieter, more direct, the quality of a door opened rather than merely unlocked. What do you want? He said. Not her legal position, not her argument. What do you actually want? She answered it honestly. The estate, she said. My father's estate, returned to the rightful line and secured under whatever law will hold it there. Aldrich is young. He was shaped by his mother, used in a different direction than I was. I don't want him destroyed, but I want the record corrected. I want it known what was done. And I want to stop being placed, by anyone, for any reason, without my knowledge and without my agreement. The estate will be returned, he said. My counsel will issue a formal correction. The covenant clause is void, built on falsified documentation, which nullifies the original contract entirely. Your stepmother will face a legal challenge through the Southern Council. That will take time, but it will proceed. She looked at him in the morning light, the steadiness in his eyes, the quality that was not performance, but simply what he was made of. You said you were looking for someone with capacity and will, she said. I did. I am not willing to be placed or arranged or managed. She held his gaze. If I am ever to stand as anyone's bonded lady, and I am not saying that I am, it will not be because a contract requires it. It will be because I have decided it is what I want. A long silence. That, Leif said, is the only version I would accept. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing worth keeping was. The legal proceedings moved with the grinding deliberateness of institutional process. Maren, when confronted by the Southern Council's representative with the evidence of the altered documents, did not confess. She simply ceased to offer explanations, which was confirmation of a different kind. 6 weeks from the rider's return, the Southern Council found in Edith's favor. The Ashenmere estate was returned to the true bloodline. The fraudulent clause was dissolved. The fabricated debt struck from every ledger it had contaminated. Aldrich came north a fortnight after the ruling. He appeared at the outer gate alone, without his mother's men, and Edith received him in the library. He stood in the doorway with their father's eyes, and the expression of a man who has run out of things to hide behind. I knew, he said, what she was doing. I knew, and I didn't stop it. I know, she said. I'm sorry. Plain. No decoration. She thought about her father reading to her in the winter evenings, and about the Ashenwood, and the shaking hands pressed flat against her thighs. "Go home," she told him. "Manage the estate honestly. Be better than you were permitted to be. That is all I want from you." He nodded once and left. Leif did not press her. That was the thing she found most remarkable, the absence of pressure. He was present consistently, quietly, in the manner of someone who keeps their word, without requiring acknowledgement for it. He appeared in the library most evenings, sometimes with documents or questions, sometimes with nothing at all, only the quiet company of someone reading at the far end of a long table. He asked her opinion on the solicitor's brief and listened to the answers as though they were worth listening to. When she mentioned once that she missed the Ashenmere Library's collection of cartographic history, a box of 3 volumes appeared outside her door the next morning. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. She kept all 3. She noticed small things about him in those weeks. The way he touched the edge of a map when he was thinking. The fact that he drank his morning cider cold. The scar on his jaw was not alone. There was an older one along his left collarbone, visible when he came in from training with his shirt collar sitting differently. And she found herself cataloging these details with an attention she recognized as considerably more than idle observation. He laughed rarely, but when he did, it arrived suddenly and completely, usually at something she said. And it changed his whole face, the angles softening, the gray of his eyes warming towards something almost gold. And then it was gone, and she was left with the after-image of it in a way that was becoming a problem. He was careful with her. Not cautious, careful, in the sense of precise. He handed her things with the backs of his fingers, not touching her hand. He stood close enough in corridors to be heard quietly, not so close that it required address. When she was tired, he noticed before she said so, and found reasons to conclude conversations. She was in significant trouble, and she knew it, and she kept working, because the alternative, allowing herself to feel it all the way, was something she was not yet ready to do. The nightmares came irregularly, not every night. Sometimes she slept cleanly and woke to frost on the window, and the ordinary world of Greyspire going about its business. But sometimes she was back in the chapel anteroom, standing in the ivory gown while the seneschal's carriage came through the gate, and Marin was pressing pins into her hair and saying, "You look like your mother." And she woke with her heart loud in her ears, and the room too small. On the 3rd such night, she got up and went into the corridor. The north corridor at midnight was cold and narrow, lit by a single bracketed torch at each end. She sat down on the stone floor with her back against the wall and breathed, slowly, until the walls felt like the right distance again. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes when she became aware she was not alone. Leif was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, still in his outer clothes, watching her with the same quality of steadiness he always had, waiting, not asking anything of her yet. "How long have you been there?" she said. "Not long," he said. In the torchlight, the angles of his face were shadow and warmth, and there was no performance in his stillness. He was simply there in the corridor because she was there, and that was enough reason. "I have nightmares," she said, "about the chapel, about the morning." "I know," he said. "Willa mentioned it. Willa mentions a great deal of things." "She cares about you, simply." She looked at the floor. The stone was cold through her nightrobe. "I used to be very good at not feeling things," she said. "I learned it in that house." "Marin used whatever you showed her, so you stopped showing." "I thought I had become quite good at it." "You had," he said. She looked up. "I could see it at the way station," he said. "The way you held the argument in front of everything else? It was formidable." It was also armor. And now? He looked at her for a long moment. In the corridor's half-dark, his eyes were simply gray. Not iron, not flint. Just the color of very early morning. "Now," he said, "you have fewer reasons to wear it." She was quiet for a while. The torch nearest them flickered in a draught. "I was frightened," she said, "when I saw you in the courtyard." "After the ambush." She had not said this, had not intended to say it now. But it was midnight, and the corridor had the quality of truth to it. More frightened than I expected to be. He said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed the corridor and sat down beside her on the cold stone floor. Close enough that the warmth of him was a distinct presence in the cold air. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort as performance. He was simply, entirely there. She became aware of two things at once: the particular steadiness of being near someone whose presence asked nothing of you, and the fact that her heart was doing something that had nothing to do with nightmares. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. It felt important to say aloud. "I know," he said. "When I arrived at the way station, I was." She looked at the far wall. "Not of you specifically, of what you were. Everything in my life that had held authority over it had been using it. I needed to know you were different before." "Before what?" he said, very quietly. "Before I could stop building walls against you." "And now?" he said. She turned her head and looked at him. This close, in the midnight corridor, the gray of his eyes was warmer than she had ever seen it. Not warm precisely, but the quality of warmth at its edge, the way certain stones hold the sun's heat after it has gone. "Now," she said, "I think I stopped some time ago. I only just noticed." He looked at her for a long time, not moving. All that presence turned fully on her, in the dark, with no purpose in it but to see her clearly. His hand, resting at his side, moved. Not much, just enough that the back of his fingers came to rest against hers on the cold stone floor. A question, not a statement. She did not move away. They stayed like that in the quiet until her hands were warm. Spring came to Greyspire slowly, in increments. A morning when the frost did not return. A week when the training yard mud began to dry. The particular smell of thawed earth and cold pine drifting up from the forest below the ridge on still afternoons. On a morning in early April, Edith stood at her window and looked at the valley going green below, and knew, with the clean certainty of something that has been true for a while and has simply been waiting for acknowledgement, what she had decided. She went to find Leif. He was in the great hall with Rowan and two border wardens delivering their morning reports. She stood in the doorway and waited. He looked up from the document he was reading, and across the length of the hall his eyes found hers immediately. He dealt with the wardens with his customary economy, but she noticed, and she was certain he knew she noticed, that his attention returned to her between each exchange. The wardens departed. Rowan found a reason to be somewhere else. The hall went quiet. "Walk with me," she said. The north parapet was where the wind came from directly. A long stone walkway with battlements on the outer side, and a view of the ridge and the valley forest below, the sky vast overhead. In early April it was cold and clear, the air tasting of iron and pine and distant water. They walked side by side, not touching, the familiar distance. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you told me in the library, what you actually wanted from the arrangement." "Stability," he said. "Someone with capacity and will." "Yes." She looked out over the valley, then turned to look at him. The ridge wind moved in his hair. He was watching her with the full weight of his attention, and beneath it something she recognized now, something that had been held for a long time with the same careful restraint he brought to everything, waiting without demanding to be acknowledged. "I find that I am no longer thinking about this as something I am navigating toward an exit from," she said. "I'm thinking about it as a place I want to be, and a person I want to be near." She held his gaze, freely. "On my own terms, not because a contract requires it, because I have decided it." He was very still. "Edith," he said. Just her name, deliberate, unhurried, as though the syllables were worth getting right. "You said," she reminded him quietly, "that was the only version you would accept." Something happened in his face, Not the near smile, not the careful containment she had spent 3 months learning to read. Something that came from deeper and was less guarded. He reached out and took her hand, the first time he had done so. Not quickly, not urgently, but with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, holding it with a steadiness she had been building toward trusting. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not a woman who says things she doesn't mean," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was a smile. Complete, brief, entirely real, changing his face the way she had catalogued it changing in the mornings from her window, and gone before she could fully hold it. "No," he said, "you are not." His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a small thing. The ridge wind came through the battlements. "There will need to be a council ceremony," he said. "Rowan will require—" "Leif." He stopped. "I know all of that," she said. "I have been thinking about it for weeks. I have read every relevant precedent, and I am genuinely prepared. But right now, on this parapet, I would appreciate it if you would stop thinking about the council and simply—" He turned to her, and the rest of the sentence went unspoken. He was close. The distance had closed by some degree she had not tracked, and his free hand moved to her face, not cupping it, only the edge of his fingers along her jaw. Careful, as everything with him was careful, as if he understood that she was not fragile, but that she had been handled carelessly before and had no intention of allowing it again. The ridge wind came through the battlements. Below, the valley was turning green. She did not move away. The bond rite was held on a morning in May, when the apple trees in the lower courtyard were in blossom, and the ridge wind, for once, came warm from the south. Edith stood in the great hall in a dress she had chosen herself. Deep blue, good wool, silver at the cuffs. No embroidered cornflowers. She had left those behind in a room she had walked away from and not looked back at. The council was present. Rowan, who had become something approaching an ally across the difficult months. The border wardens she now knew by name. Willa at the hall's edge, very deliberately not crying and not succeeding. 3 lords from the allied packs who had, over the course of the morning, quietly revised their assessment of what the North March's new lady was going to be. Leif stood at the far end of the hall and watched her walk toward him, and his expression was the one she had learned to read. That stillness which was not absence, but the deepest form of attention, and beneath it, the thing that had never been performed, that she had been given time enough to trust. "You don't have to," he said, very quietly, when she reached him. "Even now, even here." She looked at him. In the hall's spring light, the gray of his eyes held the warmth she had catalogued at the parapet, in the corridor, across the library table. The quality of warmth at the edges, the steadiness that was simply what he was made of. "I know," she said. "That is precisely why I am going to." The Ashenmere estate was administered from Greyspire thereafter, with Aldrich as its steward. He was a better steward than he had been a conspirator. He kept honest accounts. He wrote to Edith twice yearly and she wrote back. Not warmth, not yet, but the careful architecture of people who have chosen to build rather than burn. Maren was tried by the Southern Council and stripped of the Ashenmere name, the properties she had held through marriage, and the social standing she had spent 2 decades constructing. She left the Southern Territories. No one recorded where she went. Agnes, in Dunmere, received a letter 6 months after the bond rite, with a package. Coffee, expensive and unusual this far north. 3 silver marks for the alehouse's winter stores, and a note that said only, "The boots are still in good service. Thank you." Agnes read the letter 3 times, and did not show it to anyone for a long time. Edith kept the borrowed wool cloak. It hung in the back of her wardrobe in Greyspire's north wing, the mud stain long since cleaned from the hem, the lining where the coins had been sewn now empty and carefully stitched closed. She did not wear it. She did not need to. But she kept it, because it was important to remember the road, the wet cobblestones of Dunmere, the ashen wood, and the shaking hands pressed flat against her thighs. the cart with the gray wool bales and the amber sky over the ridge. The moment she had looked at Greyspire for the first time and understood that she had arrived, not as what had been arranged, not as cargo or instrument or thing to be placed, but on her own terms, by her own road, with nothing to offer but the truth and the will to make it enough. She had been right. It had been enough. Some mornings she stood at the north parapet with the ridge below, and the valley forest stretching south, and the wind in her hair, and thought about the girl who had climbed an orchard wall in a chapel gown before dawn, and decided that forward was the only direction left. She had been right about that too. It had only ever been forward. Edith of Ashenmere did not escape. She did not flee into the dark and hope that someone would come to save her. She walked toward the thing that frightened her most, the man who had ordered her, the fortress that had been built around her future without her knowledge, the truth that no one wanted spoken aloud. And she walked toward it with 9 silver coins in a cloak lining and borrowed boots that did not fit, and nothing else but her own clarity. She was dressed as a bride and treated as a debt to be paid. She had no documents, no witnesses, no one in her corner. What she had was the one thing no one had thought to take from her: the ability to think precisely under pressure, and the refusal to pretend she didn't know what she knew. That is the whole story, really. Not the contract, not the conspiracy, not even the slow, careful thing that grew across a library table between 2 people who had both learned the hard way that trust is not given. It is built, deliberately, one honest word at a time. The story is about a woman who was handed a future she did not choose, and chose a different one. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply by continuing to move forward when every structure around her was designed to make her stop. You are not the sum of what has been arranged for you. You are the sum of what you walk toward when the arrangements fall apart. Edith climbed a wall at dawn and changed everything. The only thing she was certain of in that moment was this: she would not look back. She never needed to. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? The orchard wall, the ashenwood, the library, or the parapet? I read every single one, and your words genuinely keep this channel alive. If this story stayed with you, like and subscribe. The next one is already waiting. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.